In the middle of the 3rd century, there was a much greater controversy. The 2nd century had unity throughout pretty much all of the 2nd century. There was a small division where a false prophet by the name of Montanus was kicked out of the church, and he gained some followers. But there wasn't really any major divisions in the church in the 2nd century. In the 3rd century, there was one. The 3rd century church was really not as strong as the 2nd century was. And we know this because of this particular division. They had to deal with something that the 2nd century church had never had to deal with. In the 2nd century, they had persecution. But the 2nd century church, we know from their testimony, for the most part, the Christians just stood during persecution. You don't ever find anywhere in the 2nd century church where they're talking about what to do with people who denied Christ during persecution. Instead, you find things like there's a writer by the name of Athenagoras who wrote a letter to the emperor in AD 177, and in it he says, it's called A Plea for the Christians. And he says, I want you to take note of how we handle what you guys do. It's not just our men who stand up to your persecution, but even our young boys and our women. Treat your crosses, your wild beasts, and every other form of punishment you throw at us with the inspired patience of suffering. And I'm telling you that can only happen by the power of God. So their testimony was that our people, all of us, from the greatest to the least, stand up during persecution. But it was not so during the 3rd century. During the 3rd century, you had people falling away during persecution. And this brought up a problem. When persecution ended, and some of those people who lapsed during persecution came back and said, hey, can we come back into the church church had to decide, what do we do with these people? Well, what the church has decided is that they would let these people back into the church. Now, they did put discipline upon them, and they banned them from communion for a certain amount of time, but they let them back into the church. But there was a man in the Church of Rome who didn't like that. His name was Novatian. And he went, I'm not putting up with these people who have denied Christ coming into the church. I'm going to leave, I'm going to form my own church, and I'm going to be the Bishop of Rome. And so he formed a Novatianist church right in Rome, and that actually spread a little bit. And there was a division within the church in the 3rd century, the very first major division within the early church. This division brought up one more problem. And that problem is, division was not common in the early church like it is today. We have denominations everywhere in the 21st century. But in the 3rd century, that was not common. This was the first major division of the church. And there were people in the Novatianist churches who went, hey, this isn't right. We've split the church. So not only did people who leave with Novatian end up going back to the apostolic churches, but there were also people who had been converted in the Novatianist churches and baptized by them who wanted to go back into the apostolic churches. So the question arose, what do we do with these people who've been baptized by Novatian and by his churches? Do we let them just come back into the church and accept their baptism because they believe everything we do? Or do we go, no, you have to be rebaptized? Well, the churches actually met and thought about it. There was a council that met in North Africa of some bishops, and they went, we're going to make these people be rebaptized. We cannot accept the baptism of heretics. Now, heretics to them did not necessarily mean you taught some terrible thing. It meant division to them. Now, a lot of times, being divided from the church, the reason that you divided from the church is because you taught some terrible thing. And so it's come down to our day as a heretic is someone who teaches some really false doctrine. But in the early church, a heretic was someone who divided. They divided from the church. So they went, we're not going to accept the baptism of heretics. People need to be rebaptized. Well, the Bishop of Rome at that time was Stephen, and he did not agree with that decision. He said, I'm going to accept their baptism, and I'm going to let people in. And he wrote to the churches in North Africa, and he said, hey, you guys need to listen to me. I'm telling you that you need to accept this baptism, and you need to listen to me because I'm in Rome. And you know those keys of the kingdom, Cyprian, that you talk about being handed to the bishop? Well, in reality, they were handed to the bishop at Rome. It's me who stands in succession from Peter, not you. So that's what he wrote to the churches in North Africa, and here's what happened. I'm reading to you from the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 5, And it describes a second council that Cyprian held. When he got that letter from Stephen, it says, when Stephen, Bishop of Rome, had by his letters condemned the decree of the African Council on the baptism of heretics, Cyprian lost no time in holding another council at Carthage. Carthage is in North Africa, with a greater number of bishops. That number of bishops is 87. Cyprian said, and this is this quote is from that conference. It's what he said there. Neither does any of us set himself up as a bishop of bishops, a bishop over other bishops, nor by tyrannical terror does any compel his colleague to the necessity of obedience, since every bishop, according to the allowance of his liberty and power, has his own proper right of judgment, and can no more be judged by another bishop than he himself can judge another bishop. And this is what was accepted by that council at Carthage with 87 bishops in North Africa, and it is what they sent to Stephen. They said, you cannot do this. You can't tell another bishop what to do. Now, I want to point out to you that most of the arguments that the Roman Catholic Church gives, saying that the pre-Nicene Church had a pope, come from quotes from Cyprian, because like I said, Cyprian did say that the keys of the kingdom were given to Peter, and Peter passed those keys of the kingdom on to the bishops of the church. However, what he believed is that it was to all the bishops of the church, not just to Stephen, and he didn't appreciate Stephen saying they got passed to just me. And so what this council of 87 bishops said is, you can't set yourself up as a bishop of bishops, and nor by tyrannical terror can you compel your colleagues to the necessity of obedience. One bishop can't judge another bishop. Every one of them has their own right of judgment. That's what 87 bishops in North Africa believed. Now, what portion of the church is that? It's a very large portion. 75 years later, the Council of Nicaea happened. Constantine collected all the bishops of the Roman Empire. How many bishops was that? Barely over 300. 304 is what they say. So 87 bishops 75 years earlier would represent anywhere from a third to a quarter, maybe, of all the bishops in the Roman Empire. Now here's another letter that Cyprian sent, not to Stephen, he sent it to a colleague of his. And this is what he said in that letter, and this is letter number 73 in the Epistles of Cyprian. You can find it in volume 5 of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. You can find it in other places. They're not always numbered exactly the same, but they'll be close. It's number 73 in volume 5 of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And he writes to another bishop, and he says, in this respect, I am justly indignant at this so open and manifest folly of Stephen, that he who so boasts of his place of his episcopate, the office of bishop, and contends that he holds the succession from Peter, on whom the foundations of the church were laid, should introduce many other rocks and establish new buildings of many churches, maintaining that there is baptism in them by his authority. So what he's saying is, I'm pretty upset with this open and manifest folly of Stephen the Bishop of Rome, in that he's accepting their baptism, and thus he's introducing many other rocks. He calls himself a descendant of the rock Peter, but now he's made all these other rocks by accepting their baptism and establishing new buildings, whereas Christ said he would build it upon Peter. But here's these people who have separated from Peter and his descendants who are bishops, and he's making them into churches. So I'm indignant at this open and manifest folly of Stephen. Clearly, at least Cyprian did not believe that Stephen was a pope that he had to listen to. Yet the Roman Catholic Church quotes Cyprian almost exclusively in their defense that there was a pope in the early Christian church. It's really, I'm sorry, I can't think of a better word, it's really kind of ridiculous that that happens.